Hi, Ruth.
Greetings, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Nice to see
Good. How is it there?
you. It's okay.
Good. Not too chilly, not too snowy, not too anything?
No, we've just come out of a really cold, horrible. It just broke this week, so we're back to having. I can feel my toes again, which is a
Oh,
nice.
good. That's
We
nice.
had like a really cold snap for the last couple of weeks, which especially when the only thing you can really do for at the moment is go for walks. When the weather is awful, it's really unfair. So
I
um,
completely agree. It really makes a huge difference in one's sort of level of coping.
yeah, absolutely. But like you guys, I mean, in Chicago, it must be presumably it's still really cold.
It is. We just got dumped on. We got a huge last night, a huge snowstorm. So we actually opened the store a bit later than normal today. So we
Oh
opened
wow,
it.
okay.
Yeah, we opened at noon rather than 10, just because it's taking people like even an hour just to dig out of their parking spaces, etc.
Oh my
So
goodness.
yeah. So anyway,
But great, the bookstores are open. They're not open here, so.
oh, I know. I've been reading about that, and I just read something this morning that they are not open in Portugal either, and their Portuguese bookstore community is working towards getting bookstores declared essential.
Ah, nice.
And we in Chicago, we were talking about that as a group of bookstores to try and contact the mayor and see if we could, get her to agree that bookstores were essential, because she agreed that liquor stores were essential. And
So,
yeah, so there are lots of other sort of interesting essential businesses.
yeah, it is
Well,
funny. Yeah, it is
yeah,
funny what gets deemed. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So, but I'm sorry. I think it's really a blow for everybody. I mean, it's I don't know how familiar you are with us, but we opened last year, 2020, on March 14th and had to close on March 16th.
Oh my God.
So,
Oh my God.
so this is really our first year, and it's been a tough one. There's no mistaking
Yeah.
it.
Oh my God. I'm so sorry. That is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So, but it's been, I mean, the community has been tremendous. People have embraced us just so kindly. It's really been
Oh,
wonderful.
that's lovely. I'm glad.
Yeah,
Well, hopefully the worst of it is over, and
it's behind
great-
us.
yeah, and great that you're open now. So yeah,
Yeah,
just
yeah.
keep going.
Okay, so let's talk The Butcher's Blessing. Uh,
Exciting.
okay, so I do have to tell you that it was one of my, so we do a top 5 pick, and it was one of my top 5. I ended up with a couple of Irish writers in my top 5 last year. I don't know how tight the Irish writing community is, and obviously you're in London, but Keelan Hughes.
Oh yeah. I know her. Yeah. I
Okay,
mean, I know her a little bit as much
yeah,
as we all know each other, but yeah.
yeah. So Wild Laughter was another one of my
Yeah,
favorites
it's
last
brilliant.
year.
It's so
Yeah,
good.
yeah, I really enjoyed it. So
Yeah,
I had,
I always think in another life where events and festivals and stuff would have gone ahead in 2020. I think our two books. I think it's quite
oh,
interesting to have kind of like young feminist writers writing
yes,
books about like dudes on farms. Like that's like kind of
yes.
crazy.
And I feel like, I mean, and this is a question that I was going to pose, but, and we can talk about it in a second, but the concept of both of your books as sort of being realist, well, what do we want to call it? Like historical fiction? Like, I mean, I don't know how far back one wants to go to consider something historic, but I feel like they are both set back in time and both sort of surrounding something that impacted your country substantially. So in that sense, I feel like from a genre point of view, they're similar in a way also. I don't think either of them can be just considered historic fiction, but I feel like they're both sort of genre bend in that sense. Neither of them is exactly in one genre or the other, but they are both touch on the historic fiction aspect and two sort of political and economic things that happened in your country at the same time. So
Yeah, no, I mean I have all sorts of thoughts about that also because like the historic fiction is so interesting because 1996 wasn't actually that long ago and like I was
no,
alive and whatever, but like I had to do as much research and as much like scene setting or world building as I would have if it had been set 100 years ago, you know. So I think and in a way because people reading the book will have very much lived through that period, you almost have to be like, do more research to,
Yes.
Capture that time and that moment, just because, even though I was alive, I wasn't living on a cattle farm on the Northern Irish border. So like that world is still new to me. So it kind of doesn't matter if it's 20 years ago or 50 years ago or whatever. So yeah, I'm really interested in that kind of like, what do we define? There's like a great quote from, I think, Margaret Atwood, who kind of says that like all books are historical fiction because they all are writing about things that have happened. So like, and the way that we have to, the work that we have to do is kind of the same, whether it's 20 minutes ago or 20 years ago or 200 years ago. So.
Well, and it's really true when your reader is reading about a time period in which they were alive, you really need to be very historically accurate and accurate, even location accurate, et cetera, et cetera. So I imagine the research involved is huge. How long did it take you to write the book?
I think it took me, I mean, it's kind of hard to, probably like 3 to 4 years, like a long time.
Okay, yeah. And how much of that was research? How did that how did that play out? How did you build that?
I probably spent the first year or so just doing research, and then I kind of research as I go along. But also like I do so many different types of research when I'm writing books. Like I obviously read nonfiction, and like I learned a lot about cows, for example, that kind of thing. But then also like I read a lot of fiction because I think that like there's no better way to like learn about a time or a place than reading fiction set there, because it can often capture the texture of a place so much better than any kind of really dry academic work does. I read like every newspaper article from the Irish Times in the year of 1996. So like that was one kind of research. I went to like the border counties. I visited farms there. I interviewed farmers. So yeah, so it feels like a, in terms of what, like it's really hard to demarcate the research process and the writing process, because it never really stopped. You know what I mean? It's just like so part of what I was doing.
Right.
And I love that side of it. And I do way too much of it. Like I kind of have, as I said, I could like write, a PhD on mad cow disease now, which like I don't really need to have that much knowledge about it for, but I like that curiosity and that kind of digging into a subject and going deep. I just like, I'm a total nerd, so I can't really help myself. So I love that. And also like I find it useful not only because it like grounds you and gives you, I guess, an authority to write about stuff and know that you're doing it well, but also like half the time it just throws up such good stuff. Like you find such good stuff, just like some of the best, like I don't know, just like an example I always talk about is that like, it mentions in the book that like when the kind of cattle smuggling over the border was getting really bad, and they like sent out the police and the army to like barricade the border, and like they called it Operation Matador. And I was just like, that is so good. Like if a fiction writer made that up, you like wouldn't believe them because it just sounds so ridiculous, but like that was true. So you just find these things, these hidden gems when you're doing your research, and you're just like, oh yeah, I'll take that, thank you.
Yeah, and I think the more research, the more realistic the feel of a novel is. So I think the research time spent is really well spent, because you can always get that feel of realism in a novel. And so I think, and you can also get the feel when it hasn't been that well researched, or when the background is not part of the novel. I always love it when the background is almost virtually a character, like the whole, mad cow is virtually a character in the novel. And so I really always appreciate that as a reader. So I think you can't do too much research. So
Okay,
how did you get the idea? Like how did the pieces, the different threads come together to form your idea?
So I guess two like really separate starting points, because it's really hard. Like at the time, I think as a writer, you've no idea like where your ideas come from, and it's only when the book has been published people then like ask you to go back and almost like construct a like origin story for how the book came about. So I think for me there's like a dual, like one is just like a general long-standing fascination in kind of Ireland's many layers of belief and faith. because I think it's so funny that like everyone knows that Ireland is like a super religious country, and you know, the kind of whole Catholic Protestant history, conflict, etc. But then also like it's a country that's so, you know, it's steeped in folklore and mythology and superstition, and like no one sees these two things as being in contradiction. Like it's totally, no one blinks an eye if you're like a devout Catholic, but you also like leave a dish of water by the doorway so that the fairies won't cross your threshold and that kind of thing. And like it's kind of insane to me that like even now those people hold those two sets of beliefs, and there doesn't seem to be any tension between the two. So I'm really interested in that just generally. And then the actual like kernel of the idea, I guess, I went on a road trip with a friend like years and years ago, a guy I was living with, and we were just talking to kill time, and he was telling me about his father was a farmyard vet in Ireland, and he just started telling me like funny stories of like crazy stuff his dad had seen down the years. And then a lot of the stories were like around the time of Mad Cow, and just like stuff about the kind of the smuggling and the dodgy dealing and the forging of documents and spattering them with blood to make them look authentic, and like all this kind of crazy. And it was like this like almost underworld, like mafia style beef crime, I don't know, just like all this stuff. And I had no idea. This is all new to me. Like I grew up in Dublin, I'm a city girl, I've basically never been on a farm in my life, but I just was like, wow, this is so cool, this is like something from a movie. So yeah, so I guess I just started researching from there, and then the kind of two kind of starting points started to collide, and I was like, maybe we could do something that does the faith and superstition thing but also does the Mad Cow thing. And yeah, how can I bring them together?
Okay, and then so how about the story then of the woman with the sons, sort of the basis of having the 8 butchers?
Mm-hmm.
Where does that come from? How does that come into all of that? Is that a real myth that's told in Ireland, or is that one that you made up yourself?
It's a great question, and unsurprisingly one that I get asked quite a lot
Sure.
with the book.
Sure.
So the roundabout way of answering your question is that like when I decided that I wanted to write a book that was exploring kind of tradition and superstition and also cows, you know, I was reading a lot of old kind of books of Irish folklore and going to like folklore archives and stuff, and I started noting down all the ones that were related to cattle. And loads of stuff like, you know, burning a certain herb under a cow's nose before you kill it, or that it should be facing a certain direction, or like tying a knot in its tail, or like all these things. So all of those traditions kind of existed, but I kind of brought them together. And then yes, the butchers as a group are indeed I don't want to say a fabrication, amalgamation of mine. And like, you know, there was loads of stuff going on in my like bringing together those traditions. Obviously, you know, cows and the slaughter of animals, whether it's kosher or halal or whatever, you know, that's something that in different customs and traditions does tend to be a feature. Also something about the kind of like wandering nature of the group. You know, Ireland has such a like strong traveling community, and traveling groups has been part of its history and its kind of cultural fabric. So in a way it was like a blend of like all these things, and I wanted them to not like represent all of those things, almost like represent none of those things, but you know, the most important thing for me was that they were, you know, a hub, I guess, for, or like an embodiment of these old ways and these old traditions, and crucially that they were like other, and they were very much viewed as like the quintessential outsiders. But yes, they are a fabrication, and as is the kind of the curse of the farmer's widow, which kind of begins the whole book. And it is just, it's really funny how many times I get asked that, and also how angry people get actually when I tell them that I did indeed make that up, because which I find super interesting, because I just think it then raises all these questions about fiction and invention and also about superstition, because like the whole point is that like, we don't actually believe these things, do we? And like, who gets to decide? Like the idea of one superstition being like real and one being made up, I think is like an inherent contradiction in and of itself. But like, honestly, people like, I get the occasional angry email where people are like, I read that you made that up. Like, that's pretty misleading, don't you think? And you're like, oh.
Well, this is the whole concept of folklore. I mean, where folklore starts somewhere, right? And so why not have it start with you?
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
right?
Yeah.
Like, and it's a fascinating tale, and in so many ways, it makes so much sense because of all the things you just mentioned, and the mysticism and the history, and the fact that people do still put a dish out for the fairies. And you know, I'm always amazed that people believed in changelings. Like, I think that whole concept is kind of wild, and yet very fully believed. So it is interesting. And the other thing that's interesting, and I don't know that you necessarily intended it, but if you think about, you know, if you think across cultures in the world, and cows and cattle, and, you know, the different meanings that they have in various cultures, and, you know, think about India and the caste system and the reverence of the cow. And I mean, there's so many fascinating ways in which the cow works its way in to cultures all across the world. And so I feel like, to me, that just added to sort of the mysticism and the intrigue of the story. And then there's the whole political piece. And like you said, the virtual, you know, mafia that is dealing in cattle and dealing in meat. And you can so readily see that happen. So I'm like, hats off to you. I think you really, no, really, I think you incorporated all kinds of really fascinating aspects of world culture, but distilled it into an Irish background. And I think it worked. It worked beautifully. And this kind of covers, let's say, I haven't even gotten to our official questions. So one of the questions was, we did talk about the research. One of the questions is, what kind of research went into writing this story? Are there any myths or legends the butchers are based on? And then, and you talked about the travelers too. You covered this whole question. It's 3 questions that one person asked. During the bar scene, one of the characters uses the word gypsy. Is that who the butchers represented? So really, this person's question kind of nailed your whole thing there. And I think you answered it, so we don't really need to go back. But I do think it's fascinating how all of that played in. And then to piggyback on that question, was leaving out traditional religion intentional? I associate Catholicism with Ireland, and for a book that talked about religion and mysticism so much, I was surprised that regular religion didn't come up. So did you consciously leave out the hardcore Catholicism aspect of things, and the conflict that those two would have been in, or not?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I think, like, I almost I don't know, like, being Irish and kind of being raised Catholic, like, Catholicism is just, it's just there. Like, it's kind of, you don't even like think about, like, it's everywhere. And like, yeah, so I think it's only, you know, having moved away to the UK and looking back, you're just like, oh wow, that, like, the whole church and state thing, like, is still pretty weird in Ireland. I mean, less so now, but still. So I guess in a way I was more interested, I suppose, in the tension being between tradition and modernity.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I think after my first draft, I kind of realized there was like very little churchy stuff in there.
Yeah.
But I feel like to make it kind of tradition versus organized religion versus modernity, like, as you've articulated, Mary, there's already a lot going on in this book. Some might say too much. So I think, like, at some point I had to draw the line. So I think
I really loved it.
It's, you know, there's, like, it's still there. I think there's, you know, there's references in terms of like, and especially with Davy and coming, you know, realizing his sexuality, and, you know, he references the fact that, like, you know, the mothers of his classmates would be praying for him because he'd be viewed as it being a sin. And you've got, like, you know, there's stuff there. And I think there was a priest character at some point. Yeah, there is a priest character. Is there?
Yeah. I think there is, yeah.
I can't even remember. Yeah, anyway, so because he was in and then I think he was out and then he was back in. So like it's kind of there, but I think, as I said, I was more interested in this kind of modern Ireland progress, forward-looking, global stage, capitalist, new era stuff, and that being in tension with the old ways. So to add into like a third prong to that would just kind of complicate matters, and B, like, I suppose it's like assumed that it's just there, like in Ireland, like that there's just no question that like the church stuff is there. So like in a way it didn't feel totally necessary to just like keep drawing the reader's attention to it.
Right. I have forgotten the timing. I looked it up and now I've forgotten. I believe, was it not the case in 96 that the question of divorce and the question of homosexuality were kind of becoming, for lack of a better word, legalized? Like, I mean, I think that was right about that time. And I believe divorce came first and then...
No, it was the other way around. So yeah,
okay.
So 93 was 93 was when homosexuality was officially decriminalized, and then 96 was the divorce.
And then not too long ago, abortion, which is great.
Yeah, so progress.
So Ireland is giving up all their fairies.
Yeah, well, yeah. Slowly but surely. Yeah, but so I think you're right, and you know, those referenda or those kind of changes to laws and legislation, etc., are also implicitly tied to the like slow incremental, you know, separation of church and state that like was going on at that time, and as you know, is continuing to
well, and so much moving forward. I was in Dublin actually 2 years ago, and totally coincidentally ended up in a hotel that sort of over I'm not going to get this right, but along the river in kind of the tech district. And there is an astonishing amount of technology that is headquartered there, that is happening there, that is based. I mean, it's really amazing and wonderful. I mean, and it was so fun because we were with friends and had that sort of old Ireland experience, but then also very coincidentally, not realizing we had this hotel that was right in this tech center, and it was a complete contrast and really kind of cool. So
yeah, but that's like exactly, that's so interesting that you had that experience, because that is like, you know, it's almost become those two sides or those two aspects of Ireland still exist and are probably like more stark now. Whereas I feel like the book is at the moment when that kind of split is starting to occur.
Yes.
And I think I also wanted to slightly challenge, you know, there is I guess a risk of being like Ireland because of, you know, the abortion referendum and the fact that it is certainly the European HQ for Apple and Microsoft and all these big companies, and it's shiny and it's wealthy and it's progress, but like this idea that it's all just like improvement, I think is kind of dangerous in and of itself, because like, you know, the homelessness crisis in Dublin is like worse than ever. We are still kind of literally digging up the remains of women and babies from the ground from like mother and baby home scandals from only a few decades ago. So like this kind of this idea that we are like a new liberal, progressive, wonderful country, I think it's still a work in progress, and I think it's kind of really interesting to kind of challenge that like really straightforward narrative, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think the tension is wonderful in the novel and important, and I think even the tension in society. I mean, I think there's probably not a society on earth right now that isn't experiencing some, you know, version of that one way or the other. In the US right now, you know, after all the rioting in May and June, I mean, I think that we are, you know, readdressing all of that as well. Different issues, but the same kind of tension with our past and our present and moving forward more than that. So I think there's probably not a country on earth right now that isn't having some form of, you know, England is dealt with the Brexit thing. I mean, I think, so I think it's timely and important, and it was great, to feel that in the novel, to feel like, okay, the ancient versus the forward thinking, and how forward thinking is it really? And and the same old stuff holds true. It's a bar fight. It's political underhandedness. It's so many things are, even though there's new and there's different and we're moving forward, there's always that thread of the constancy, and what people know as their everyday life, and that's the part that probably needs to be changed and addressed.
Yeah, it's so interesting hearing you talk about, I guess, or being able to kind of see a certain amount of like universality to the book. I think that like there are times, I feel it's quite niche, like it's set in this little pocket of Ireland in this particular moment around this specific community. And like sometimes you tell people what your novel's about and they're like, oh, cool, and they just like, wow, that's niche. But I think like the hope is that like actually there are broader universal truths that like resonate, as you've been so beautifully articulating, like with other parts of the globe and other
Yeah. Oh yeah.
etc. So yeah.
So I mean, I think the thing to remember is, we're all human. and wherever it is that we're, that we land physically, and whatever our history is, none of it is perfect. And so we all just have to, try better, try harder. Okay, so let's see. Next question. This is very much just to the book. In the story, why didn't the wives and families of the butchers live together or nearby each other? Like, would there have been more support for them? Would they have felt more like a small community unto themselves? So that one of the people in the group is just curious why you chose to have them be more independent of each other.
It's a great question. I suppose I think there's a line in there that talks about how they do live in pair, like almost in pairs, like they all have hopefully at least another wife or partner nearby. So yeah, obviously Groa has Mrs. C, but I guess I don't know, I suppose like from a kind of strategic point of view, like the idea of isolation and being outside of even the tiny community to which you do belong was so important to kind of Groa's storyline and her kind of reckoning, I suppose, and her kind of the fact that she kind of snaps and says, you know what, like I've had enough. So I think that and I think it also shows that like even in a group that is a minority and is subject to a lot of discrimination and harsh treatment by society, like the butchers is still a pretty patriarchal group. So I'm not sure they ever kind of sat down and thought to themselves, wouldn't it be nice for the women if they, you know what I mean? Yeah. That wouldn't have crossed their mind because they don't really care about the women. So yeah. I think also that like is probably just how it would have been. But yeah, I think also, as I said, the kind of her isolation and also like, the book, it's so funny when you're writing a novel, like I got so obsessed with like the economics of like their situation because like, and I think I read somewhere, like there's a great quote, who said it has gone out of my mind, but I think like it behoves the novelist to like think about the economic practicalities, because we all read so much stuff or watch TV shows where we're like, how are they paying? That was always the thing with Friends, right? It was like, how are they paying for that apartment? Like none of them seem to have jobs. But like with with Groa and Cook, like the idea is that like his parents, it's specifically spelled out that like his parents left them that house, and that's why they live where they do. So even the idea of kind of like organizing a community in a fixed place would take some kind of like logistics or potentially like money, which I just don't think they would have, because people make. So I think I got very bogged down in the kind of economic practicalities of the situation.
Well, and you would have to think that their economics would be dwindling as time went on, as fewer and fewer people that were embracing butchers, then there goes their income. So one of the things that struck me about the novel is sort of the insider outsider piece. I felt that insider outsider flipping back and forth throughout the novel with the various characters and their various situations. And I feel like the insider outsider thing plays a big part. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
God, yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of like what the whole book is at, right? And I think in terms of like different belief systems, then the gender stuff, then the sexuality stuff, like I don't think anyone feels like, and even if you take Fionn as a character, like he is like a straight white male who's not a butcher, like in theory he should be part of the mainstream, but like because, you know, he did kind of become a bit of an alcoholic and, you know, kind of besmirch his name, and also because he has a weird wife, and a, you know, a bit of a funny son, like he's also an outsider despite the fact that he has, you know, he ticks all the other boxes. So I don't think there's anyone in the book who feels like they are, which I don't think many characters in books ever do, because that's not interesting.
No, it isn't. So. But yeah, you never get the sense that they feel like they're in with the in crowd, you know. But I think so often you're right, absolutely you're right, that in a novel most of the time you aren't in with the in crowd, because then where's your conflict?
And then Fionn briefly kind of is, or feels like he is, because he's doing, you know, all these kind of smuggling routes, and he feels like he's getting in with the boys, and then they invite him to the pub and he's like, oh, I probably shouldn't, but then he goes, and then that falls apart. So I think that kind of precarious situation and always being the outsider is
definitely. Okay, so another question: what character do you personally relate to the most?
Yeah, it's like being asked who's your favorite child. I
always answered the dog when people would ask.
Nice, yeah, that's clever.
I have 4 kids, and they were always wondering which one of us is your favorite. I always said Mookie, the dog.
I'll pick the cows. I think that I don't know. I think Una is kind of in many ways, you know, she's like the spirited odd kid, which like I definitely was. So I suppose if I have to choose, like spirited odd kid or like lonely frustrated abandoned wife, or like gay male teen, or former alcoholic male, like fundamentally Una's the one that like I have been that at some point, like odd in different ways and whatever, but like that is definitely the one that I can relate to the most. I think it's worth saying that like it's funny, at some point in the editorial process, like there was a conversation about potentially getting rid of Fionn, because my editor was like, he's not very nice, like he's basically just like a bad guy who's done loads of bad things, and like I'm not sure your reader's ever gonna feel sympathy for him. And that really, like, I was really determined that we couldn't get rid of any of them, frankly, because like the symmetry of kind of a mother and a daughter and a father and a son was so important to the book in terms of different generations and genders and whatever. But also, like, I do think that Fionn, he's hugely imperfect, but like I wanted to show like he's such a product of like his own father and his upbringing and his environment, and yes, he like did a really bad thing, but like is very sorry and is basically spending his life trying to atone for it. So we like toned him down a little bit, but you know, I didn't realize how much I cared about him until there was a risk of him getting the
sure. How much thought do you put into the symmetry of a novel? For example, the mother-daughter, father-son. The when you're writing, do you sit down and at some point look at it from that angle, or do you just go with the flow with characters and what they want to do, or do you start with, you know, here's my idea, here's where I see it going, now I'm going to fill my idea with the characters and see what I come up with, and then address the symmetry? How do you or do you even go there at all, or do you just let it flow?
Okay, well, the one thing I don't do is let it flow. I am the opposite. Like writers who do that, I just cannot fathom how they can work like that. I am a planner through and through, like a meticulous, like diagrams, graphs, post-its on the wall, like especially because like with this book, right, you've got like 4 characters and the present day arc. So you've basically got 5 bits in the jigsaw that you need to kind of, and each character has its own mini arc, but then the whole story has an overall, like it was a nightmare. It was an absolute nightmare. So I am definitely not a go with the flower because that just wouldn't be possible. I think in terms of like where the 4 characters came from is that like when I first had this idea, I like wrote loads of different characters because, you know, I came up with the concept of the butchers, and one way I could have done it is written from all 8 of their points of view. And actually I realized that the butchers themselves didn't interest me in the slightest. It was like what they represented, and then B, the kind of women and families they left behind. Like that was what was interesting to me. So I kind of started writing all these different chapters from other the other points of view around them. And like Ronan the photographer, like he was originally like a voice in it as well. But then there were just too many, so then we had to kind of boil it down a little bit. And that's where the kind of mother, daughter, father, son thing came to mind. And then I had to say, right, I've got 16 chapters, and I became really obsessed with like the number 8 because obviously there's 8 butchers, and then so you've got like 8 and 8, and then all the, and like where the kind of present day moments would interrupt, and then, you know, my editor would like make me move one thing and I was like, no, my symmetry, so I'd have to like go back and fix everything. So yeah, I'm like a bit anal when it comes to that, but well,
it pays off for you. Let's just say that it definitely paid off for you. It's you know, because it's all there, but you don't feel it. So like that's sometimes I feel like, you know, when you're getting hit over the head as the reader by that kind of stuff, then you're sort of like, oh, but it's there, but you don't feel it. You're not sitting there thinking to yourself like, oh, now we're moving to the father-son story, or now we're, you know, you don't think that way at all.
That's brilliant. Yeah, it's actually Zadie Smith who has a thing about like the scaffolding that one erects when you're writing the novel, and then the novelist's like final job should be to remove all the scaffolding, so that like the reader can't see it or isn't kind of bashed over the head of it, as you say. So yeah.
Well, it's funny, I always wonder like, where would authors be without the Post-it note? I think there are so many novels that are created on the wall.
Yeah, although but then you hear these weird people, like I go to literary festivals and they're like, yeah, I just started writing and the characters like just led me and I followed. And I'm like, what? That is just like anathema to me. So yeah. I've heard that before as well, and I know that at least for myself, I wouldn't be able to necessarily do that. I always am sort of like, oh, the character that speaks to you, and that I'm not sure that I would be able to. Yeah, I think I'm too practical. Good, me too, Mary.
Okay, so what do you see as the major theme in the book?
I would, if I had to boil it down, I would say that kind of tradition versus modernity.
Modernity, yeah.
Because I think so much spins off that in terms of gender, in terms of different generations, in terms of, I also really, someone described it really nicely at one point when the book first came out as like a coming of age story for the characters, but also for the country. And I kind of like that as a way of kind of holding it all together. So.
Well, and I think that sort of that whole genre thing, is it historic fiction? Is it a coming of age story? Is it a mystery? Is it a, you know, I think it's, that's one of the things I like best about it though, because I feel like it covers a lot of different aspects of actually of life. So
well, that's good, because I think the flip side is that, like, I don't know, it's quite interesting. It's been positioned slightly differently in the UK and Ireland versus in America. Like the covers are quite different. And like in America, they've really gone down the like literary thriller route.
Okay, interesting.
Which is interesting. But then you get lots of like avid thriller fans who then read The Butcher's Blessing, who are like, it's a bit slow. And I'm like, yeah, it is. Like, I'm not trying to write something that you're going to be, you know what I mean? So
yeah.
Like the kind of the genre thing is so interesting to me, less in terms of like where the book sits in the bookshop, because I don't really care. As long as
Right.
it's in a bookshop, I'm happy. But like in terms of like reader expectation, that is like, it's been really interesting to see how readers who come to it thinking it's a literary novel are like, oh, it's a bit violent and gruesome, and then people who come to it as a thriller are like, it's a bit slow and thoughtful. So,
and this is why we just have when you next come to Chicago, you'll have to come visit us. But we just have a wall of fiction. So we've done genre busting in the store. So we don't have anything placed. We have short stories and poetry and fiction. And the short stories and poetry are also on the fiction wall. So we just have kind of genre busted. And I know, and we've done it on purpose in the hope that when people come in the store, if you are a thriller or a mystery reader, you don't have that little nook to go directly to. So you might go to an author, and then maybe on either side of your author, see something else that might appeal to you. So a little bit of it is to try and, force people a little out of their comfort zone. But so we've done a little genre busting here in the store.
I like that. I like that a lot.
Yeah, but that's why the Butcher's Blessing fits in beautifully.
Yeah, the pan.
Exactly. So you sort of addressed this earlier, but one of the questions was, why don't the butchers speak or have a voice in the book? And I think you kind of addressed that.
Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of really great books out there about dudes in rural Ireland, and I just that wasn't necessarily what I was interested in telling. Also, even that scene where Con takes Davy to the butcher's camp to hang out and see them there, that came really late. That wasn't in the first or even the second or third draft, and my editor had to force me to do that, because he was like, I want him to go there and actually for it to be really boring and normal, you know what I mean, that it isn't this kind of and I'm glad it's there. I really like that as a scene, and I think it is fun that for all the kind of myths and rumors and whatever swirling around, that they're just some dudes kind of
hanging out,
washing their pants and having a drink, going to bed that, so I'm glad it's there. But as I said, that it just didn't even cross my mind to have more of them in it, because as I said, the two things that interest me are A, the kind of the people they leave behind, and B, the way they are viewed and treated by the rest of society. So that they as individuals I'm less interested in.
Well, and that scene is a little bit of a kick in the pants, because it's sort of hey, they're just a bunch of guys. It kind of totally normalizes their existence and takes that sort of mystic element out of it, which I thought it was really well placed, because it that whole sort of mystery behind them and what they're it's just sort of they're just some guys.
And I think the reason I didn't have that in it first is because for a really long time when I was writing this book, and this kind of goes back to our conversation about genre, I was like, am I writing magic realism? I was I couldn't figure it out. I was is this is there magic, or is there kind of, and then I was no, I was this book is a straight up realist book, to the point that the days of the week that certain songs are released, or newspaper headlines, or what, it is meticulous in terms of cleaving to fact and superstition and myth. Just because people are sharing those stories or even hold them to be true doesn't mean they are true. So nothing magic, nothing weird happens in this book at all. So I think once I had made that decision, then you're right, actually kind of quite late in the book, just pulling the curtain back and be they're just regular guys, was quite fun.
Right. But I liked it. I thought it was great. I liked the sort of normalizing of that, because then it's sort of oh, okay. Especially after Una's been through all the teasing at school and all the, so, and she doesn't really talk about her father or her family's life, or, everyone knows what her father does, but there's no specifics discussed ever in that sense. So you sort of are wow, what is this all about? And I love the, sort of the reveal of, oh, it's just some guys. And this is really their job. It's not they're doing anything, So I liked it.
But that the same could basically be said for every group that is othered, or seen as an outsider or different, or, you know, the idea that you would like peer in and just be like, ah, hello, fellow human doing really boring fellow human stuff. Like
Exactly.
that kind of is,
Exactly.
I think if we were better at reminding ourselves of that, it would be quite useful.
And then I have our last question. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between art and ethics? So I think this is going towards the photography piece. Where do you see those lines blurring in our world? And do artists have ethical obligations?
What a great question. I am very interested in art and ethics. So my previous book, which was called Nine Folds Make a Paper Swan, was a novel about basically inspired by the history of the Jewish community in Ireland. And I'm not Jewish. So that was another book where I did kind of years and years of research, similarly, like in terms of traveling around Ireland, traveling to Israel to meet the Irish community out there, a lot of archival stuff, a lot of interviews, a lot of, you know, I really wanted to do it right, and had a lot of kind of ethical conversations with myself and others along the way about what right did I have to tell this story? Was I doing it correctly, sensitively, empathically, or empathetically? I never know which it is. So that's like very much on my mind. And I think, you know, in terms of the wider kind of cultural appropriation debate, I think I'm really kind of fascinated by it, and I think it's so important. I think it's amazing that we're having those conversations. I worry sometimes that like this multiple issues get conflated in terms of like the lack of diversity in publishing versus writers should only ever be able to write about their own experience, full stop. Because if that were the case, like, right, I would never write an interesting book again because I'm not very interesting. So I think there are like really important conversations to have along that spectrum. Even within the Butcher's Blessing, you know, this idea of this minority community that did have all these rumors and myths swirling around it. And yeah, you know, Ronan the photographer, who is an artist who just wants to capture a good image, a good shot. Aren't we all, like, Amit I as a writer, always just looking for a good story, trying to, you know, waltz into a community that is not necessarily my own, and trying to shape it into something good. So yeah, the kind of ethics are really kind of something I'm super interested in, super kind of live to. And Ronan the photographer is kind of a doppelganger for me in that way, trying to navigate that, or at least to kind of foreground those questions. I don't necessarily have all the answers, and it's something that I'm constantly kind of thinking about. But he was a fun way for me to kind of get that into the book.
Okay. So one more question. Is there a question that you've been asked as you've been touring for the book and in conversation about the book that in particular either took you by surprise or has stuck with you or caused you to think about something that you hadn't thought about before?
That's a great question. I think this is sort of an answer, is that, and I've mentioned this already, but I think the importance people place on whether or not the butchers are real has like blown my mind. Like that didn't even cross my mind when I was writing the book, like, just because, yeah, it's a novel, it's all made up. So like, you know, so I think the kind of emphasis people have placed on that, has been really interesting to me. And I think that question about religion is about like organized religion, that you asked me earlier, I think is really interesting, because I kind of forgot that there isn't much of that in the book, because like, as I said, to my mind, it's a book set in Ireland, so like of course the church is there, because like it's always there. But it's so funny that like I haven't really considered in quite some time the fact that like, I don't think it was a conspicuous omission, but like maybe it was, I don't know. So that's, I'm going to go chew on that a little bit more.
Good. Okay, so I have to ask, I wouldn't be a bookseller if I were not to ask, what's next? Have you got something in the pipeline? Is there something you have to look forward to?
There is something in the pipeline. I don't know if it's, yeah, anyway, there's something. It is, I mean, it's so funny. I feel like every book responds to, I don't know, I feel like I've just set myself, every time I just set myself a new challenge in response to the previous thing I wrote. So this one, the one I'm working on at the moment, I, having written my last 2 books, had kind of this multiple point of view thing. I set myself the challenge of only having one protagonist, one character, and that terrifies me, because people are always like, wow, I don't know how you write the multi-stranded things, that must be so difficult. And I'm like, I don't know how you do the like one character just like straight through beginning to, anyway, I've cheated slightly, so it is just one character, but it jumps around in time a lot. So it starts when she's 30, and then it goes back to when she's 5, and then it goes to when she's 20, and then it goes to when she's 10, and then it goes to, so it jumps all over the place. So I spent many weeks dissecting Commonwealth by Anne Patchett to try to figure out how she does that structure. And other books of that ilk that do really ambitious, like Evie Wyld's novels, for example, do amazing things with time. So it is a chronological story, and it's basically about motherhood and art.
Nice. And do you have a time frame?
I am sending it to my agent on the 1st of March.
Oh, congratulations.
We'll see if she reads it and thinks, oh no, or, oh, okay, maybe. So after that, I don't know. So
yeah. Oh, that's wonderful though. Congratulations.
Thanks. Yeah.
That's exciting. Well, I think that kind of wraps it up. I'm just trying to think. I can't think of any. Do you feel like we covered it?
I think so.
Is there something I missed?
I think so. They were good questions.
Oh, good. Yeah, no, this has been really fun. It's so we've decided to do this, not focusing on sort of the big 5 publishers, and really trying to dig in a little bit into the smaller press world. That's a question I can ask you. How did you decide, or how did you find Tin House, or how did Tin House find you, or was it just, a mad series of query letters, or how did that come together?
Yes, they also published Ninefolds, which is my previous book.
Okay.
So yeah, this is the 2nd book I've done with them. And I also, a guy called Rob Spillman, who actually founded Tin House magazine.
Yes.
Back many
Way
moons
back
ago.
when. Yes.
Yeah. I actually know Rob. We do a lot of work together for a storytelling charity called Narrative 4, which is based in New York.
Yes.
It does these kind of story exchanges between young people from different backgrounds, and it's all about sharing stories and fostering empathy and etc. So Rob and I are both kind of heavily involved in that charity, so I met him through that.
Nice.
We love Tin House. They're so great. They're just the best.
Yeah, they are. They're wonderful.
Dream to work with.
It's almost one of those, I can't find something published by them that I don't like. So,
very good sign.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Well, Ruth, thank you so much. This has been a delight. I really appreciate it. We appreciate you spending time with us in the wee hours of the morning. And we also sincerely appreciate you taking the time to sit with us today. And just so you know, this has been recorded, and we'll be sending it via email to all of the members of our group. And if you want us to send you one, we'd be happy to.
Oh yeah, of course.
Okay, good. And I guess that's about it.
Brilliant.
So,
well, thanks so much. Thanks for picking it.
Oh, like I said, truly one of my top 5 from last year. So, and then we will be keeping our eye out for something new.
Yeah, I'll keep you posted.
Yeah, please do. Please do. Stay in touch.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks so much. Take care.
Thanks, Mary. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.